Hi everyone, welcome to my 2D animation Unity tutorials, where I'll be going through the entire process from creating a character concept to preparing it for animation, implementing, rigging, and finally creating a couple of skeleton animations in Unity, including a small standard idle, a more special idle, and a walk cycle as well. For the entire process I'm drawing on my iPad in Procreate, using Photoshop then to prep work, and then proceed to Unity. But as long as you have Photoshop and Unity installed, it doesn't really matter which software you feel comfortable producing your assets in, if it has the option to export the files as PSD files. So everything locked and loaded. Go grab a tea or a coffee and make yourself comfortable, and let's head right in. We're starting with step 1, choose or create your character. For the tutorials, I chose to demonstrate my own personal classical workflow that I've started feeling most efficient and most comfortable in. And to give you the very best insights, I'm going to use my project Sundown for it, with a fresh and new character I just designed for the game. Sundown is kind of a cozy life sim, if you want to categorize it, and therefore there's a few couple standard characters needed for the game mechanics that are in the game. We already have a craftsman that teaches our player how to collect and craft items and how to use tools. We have a guide that goes through the tutorials and is kind of an all-rounder whenever a player gets stuck or needs hints. And next on the priority list is now a fashion designer or a seamstress, since collecting accessoires and sewing or recoloring your own clothes plays a crucial role in the game as well. So before I start wildly designing ahead, I usually note down some just very basic attribute ideas that I could imagine the character to be like or look like. And this can be both personality traits as well as superficial looks. In this case, my very first parameters were the seamstress is a female character. She is very tall, she looks elegant and is visibly skinny as well. She's a bit cocky, snooty and arrogant, usually very reserved and a bit edgy as well, but she warms up to you later in the game. Other facts are included where she has a tent where she puts her self-made clothes and accessoires on display and sells them, and she focuses on sustainable and alternative fashion only. Now, when it comes to deciding for a character, try to keep the scope manageable from the start. Unity is a great engine for doing 2D games, especially when they are stylized, but it has limitations still. There's lots of nice 2D animation softwares out there that have a lot more possibilities and fancy features, such as Spine for example, but of course animating directly in the engine has the perk of not having to bother with export-import and compatibility problems. So with having this advantage in mind, we have to kind of make a compromise on the level of details and complexity we can work with. Therefore, when creating or choosing the character you want to work with, I recommend keeping your goals and demands always in mind during the design process. For example, in how many different directions can the character walk? Is it only forward in a simple side-scroller, or can they walk in 4 different directions or even 8 different directions for a top-down game? The more directions the player character can walk to, the more different angles you need to draw and animate them from, the more time it takes. How many hours can you provide in your project time schedule for just having the character walk? How many other animations do you need for this character? How many different characters do you want to animate in the game? Are they also going to walk in 8 different directions? If you decide to go for more directions, you might need to put the level of detail down to save some time then. In our case, if we take the player character for example, who can kind of walk in all directions but is only visible from a front view in the entire time, it leads to a compromise as well. We wanted modular assets and the option of sprite exchange as well. So if I would have decided on letting the player characters sprite swap every time they change directions in their walk cycle, like walking towards the top means now you see the character from the back, I would have needed to draw and animate every sprite from the back as well. All the different body parts, arms, legs, but also the different clothes, the hairstyles, etc. And this every single time I want to add a new piece of hair or clothes to the game. Going with a fairly simple art style, or pixel art for example, makes this a lot more feasible and quicker. But if you want to have super complex characters with lots of detail and whatnot, you might need to downgrade at another point then. So always keep your scope in mind while designing and see what you can actually realistically do in your given time. Now, while I was rambling on and on about scope and restrictions, you can see that my seamstress character is slowly coming together now. Another important thing to keep in mind while designing is, of course, consistency. Obviously, you would want a diverse range of different characters that all differ from each other and that are special, but you also want to make sure that they are consistent in style and that it works harmonically together and kind of makes sense as well. In Sundown, there's a humanoid player character kind of being thrown into this weird magical forest that is inhabited by different creatures. Ideally, the creatures still have few traits in common, so in this case I designed some kind of species that share certain features. For example, they have frog kind of feet, and they have those weird glowing butterfly or snail-like antennas on their heads, as well as those long arms with big prawns as hands. Otherwise, they can differ completely in terms of body size and color and whatnot, but they still look kind of consistent. We're going into that a bit more into detail later. What you can see what I'm doing now is another very important factor during the design process: readability. While you want to keep consistency in mind, you still need to find a proper balance between differentiating your character from the environment, but also not let it stand out too much and still make it blend in a little bit, so it doesn't look too alien in this world. In this case, while going for the colors, I kept in mind that the creatures live in a dark world where there's always night, meaning the colors shouldn't be too saturated and bright. Yet if I keep the character too dark and the colors not in contrast to the green-bluish colors of the forest, the character might get lost in it completely and would be difficult to distinguish from the floor or the plants and the trees. So I usually take a screenshot out of the environment of the game and then put a couple of different color variations of the character in front of it to see which colors work and which are too difficult to read. In the end, I went with a more brighter version, deciding I like the character standing out a bit more, and after showing the character around and gathering some feedback for the last step of the design, I also added a couple more details to have more of a connection to sewing and underline the sustainability part even more as well, by adding a few patches and making it seem more second-hand and working with reusable fabric, etc. After having the very first concept sheet done, where I usually draw the character from different perspectives and in different poses, the next thing to do when I want to animate a character is doing an emotion sheet. Here I usually concentrate on some main emotions that show the character express themselves in a mimic whenever they are angry about something, sad, disappointed, anxious or happy, as well as relatively neutral, of course. This also comes on handy later when I need those specific emotions as sprites for the dialogue boxes. But it also helps with getting a better in-depth feeling on how your character behaves and what movements could look like. In the end, I usually throw it all into one big sheet that I can always keep open on my second screen for reference. For me, this is super helpful, and I can only recommend working with something like this. Alright, awesome. Our character concept is done. Now we need to think about step 2. Prepare your character for animation. Here we have two different options, depending on what you choose to work with. We're going through both options individually, but let's start with option number 1, in which case you choose an already existing character that you at some point drew. Maybe you only have a simple laying PNG drawing from it, and that's totally fine. We can work around that if you want to, simply by cutting out the different body parts that we want to animate. Both options, of course, have their advantages and disadvantages, so one might work better for you than the other, and it might be different from person to person. Here's what works best for me. With option 1, as you can observe here, we can use an already existing image. There's no need to redraw anything, we can just use what's already there. And that might save us some time. But since we need to use the scissor tool to cut things out, it's never really just as clean as it could be. Since everything is on one single layer, the cleanup work can be quite chaotic, and since we can't simply empty-headed just draw, it's also a bit more difficult, and one needs to concentrate a bit more. And it's also more prone to mistakes. And we're also not super flexible with it. We have to use whatever resolution there is, which might become a problem later. What we have now is a so-called sprite sheet. I've cut everything into separate pieces that can be then puzzled together to a character, but still moved separately. Awesome, so we can proceed to the engine now, right? Sadly, not quite yet. Here's why the option 1 sadly did not work for me in this case, and I mentioned it before already. Consistency. When we use an image that is already being created, we sadly can't influence or decide on the size and resolution of the canvas anymore. Our project, on the other hand, has a very specific resolution that we agreed on from the start, which means, ideally, the different assets all need to be in the exact same resolution and scale as well. Now, when I was working on my concept art piece for the seamstress, I was working with creating a nice and clean concept piece in my mind, not with creating final in-game assets. So when I started working on a new canvas, I set the size to 4K resolution, while our game is only in HD. As you can imagine and see now, if I implement the new character into our game world, she will be way too big, compared to the other characters and objects, of course. Now, what could solve this would be to downscale the new character. This can be both done in Photoshop or in Unity as well, but we now run into a consistency problem art style-wise, because we're not only scaling down the character, but everything with it, including the outlines. They were working perfectly fine with the rest of the sprites, its original size, but now that we downscaled it, the outlines are super thin and therefore the character looks very different compared to the other sprites. So now we move over to option number 2, which is the option I'd always prefer and recommend. Draw your character freshly anew with 2D animation in mind already from the start. Let's look into the advantages and disadvantages again. So having animation in mind while you create your character assets from the beginning helps things structured and organized. You're prepared, you plan ahead. We don't need to cut things out here, so we have more clean results, and we have outlines, colors, etc. everything you need on separate layers, which is an absolute blessing if you want to stay flexible and need to adjust something during the process eventually. The method is also quite easy and super efficient from the beginning. It might be slightly annoying having to redraw your entire character, even though you already have such a nice concept art for them. And for some artists it might be more frustrating of a process, since you can't just draw however you please. You kind of need to think what goes where and how the parts need to be in order to be working nicely for animation. So it can be a bit more demanding. But I promise it's worth it. And as you can see with both options, we kind of finish with the exact same result, a nice sprite sheet. Just in this case it looks slightly more clean and it actually works with the in-game resolution. Comparing both results side by side might not look like that much of a difference, but you will see in the engine soon that it actually feels a lot more coherent with option number 2 in the end. Anyways, moving on to how we're gonna export and import this now into Unity. So I've been using Procreate to create my character, but we are going to need PSB files in the end. So what I usually do is I save my file in Procreate as a PSD file, and then I open the file in Photoshop. Here I make sure again that my layers are properly named and checked and do some prep work. For example, we now have everything still in groups and on separate layers, which is great for whenever we want to adjust the sprites, but now we only need them on one layer again because we want to move the whole pieces all together, right? So what I'm gonna do is I'm merging the layers together. The quickest way is by selecting them and pressing STRGE. And try to come up with a good naming convention for your layers as well. Not something like layer 1, layer 2 and so on, because you want to be able to quickly distinguish them later in the engine. And unless you have a photographic memory and can somehow remember exactly which part of the body is supposed to be on layer 23, you might as well just name them left ear or right leg or L foot or R eye, for example. As long as you can quickly find them, choose whatever works best for you. Next thing is, we're going to cut the image to the according size of the character. We don't need the image to be unnecessarily bigger. We're gonna delete the background layer because we ain't gonna need that anymore. And we want our character to have a transparent background, and then we can go and save under File, Save as .psb, which is a larger file size to work with, but it has its perks. Unity is able to read PSB files quite nicely and will automatically, if you put your file in, create a nice sprite sheet for you and know the different layers. Super practical, because usually if you import a sprite sheet as a PNG, you need to go into Unity, then cut out the different pieces, etc. This way with PSB you save an entire step very nicely. So now what's gonna happen? Correct, we're finally proceeding to Unity. Remember to open GitHub first or whatever software you're using for your repository if you're working on a project with a teammate. Check first if there's any changes you need to pull or something, and then open your Unity project. Okay, and here we are with step number 3, implementation. Alright, so we finally arrived in the engine, so what we're gonna do now is we're going to where you save your art assets, which in my case is under assets, art, and then NPCs. And here we see the other PSB files already, so the one of the craftsman and the guide. Now we're simply going to drag and drop the PSB file into the folder, and you can see already by pressing on it that Unity reads the layers just as we had them in Photoshop. Then you should check your settings for the character sprites and the inspector on the right, and in general usually have your texture type set to sprite, 2D and UI, the sprite mode set to multiple, and now what's interesting here is the pixels per unit, and this has kind of to do with the size of your assets. The number is not important since this is a very individual thing, but we have it's set on 700 pixels per unit for every sprite we implement, and this way we make sure the resolution of everything stays coherent as well. But the 700 doesn't really matter for you that much, it's just depending on how you decide to work with the assets. The rest for now is not super relevant, but what you want to do is you want to check your layers again and make sure nothing is weird or missing. What's very practical, because here I realized I'm not seeing the layer with the closed eyes on it. Whenever you need to adjust something on the layers, you can just click in the PSB file in your art assets folder, and out of Unity, basically you can open Photoshop again. So automatically, if you press on the PSB file, Unity opens Photoshop for you. Then you can adjust whatever you need, and in this case I had to simply make the eyes closed layer visible again, because I had the eye off here. And then I hit save, and it will automatically update in Unity afterwards as well. Now, if everything looks good, you can save your character as a prefab. And as you can see, there's already a prefab of the craftsman and one for the guide saved in here as well. It's under assets, prefabs, characters, NPC. And I advise you to do the same as with prefabs. You have a lot more reusability. You keep your scripts in one place as well as your settings and everything. So once you create a prefab out of it, in my case, that's already happened because I just copied the prefab of the craftsman to have all the settings we need in the beginning, just exchange the sprites. But now that you have your prefab, you can just drag your character into the scene and then move it to wherever you want it now. Awesome. Next, I quickly wanted to show you the difference between the two different options we used. I put both sprites directly next to each other and pressed play basically, so I started the game. Can you see how the right version looks much more out of place than the left version? And another thing you probably saw is the layering is still a bit weird, as the pine tree is currently under the character, but it should be above, of course. So what our character needs is a thing called a sorting group. A character itself, if it's on different layers, automatically has a sorting group on its own. You can see that once you start animating and you want to do a sprite swap, then you start working with different layers again. You will need sorting groups as well. Those simply define which layer is on top or below which layer. So for the seamstress, for example, we know that the tail layer is placed under the body, so the tail could be, for example, on layer 1. Then there is the legs on layer 2 and 3, and the left arm on layer 4, and then there is the body layer on top of them. The right arm is above it on layer 6 and so on. So now if you put a sorting layer onto your character, you can decide on which layer the character is on in its entirety in the whole game world basically. So now it's not about its single parts, but altogether how it behaves with the rest of the sprites. So if all of the grass on the floor is on layer 0 and the trees are on layer 2, then the character ideally should be on layer 1, for example. And now it works with the layering, you see? Which brings us now to step 4, rigging. First you can see now is the sprite editor. You can see here the step that the PSB file does for us automatically. The sprites are cut accordingly to their sizes. Otherwise you would need the sprite editor to manually create your sheet like this. And you can open it either by going into the inspector of your art assets and click under general on the right, open sprite editor, or you can search it on the Window 2D sprite editor. Now that our sprites are already perfectly cut for us, we can already move forward to the skinning editor, which you can find if you go on the middle top left corner and press on that little arrow next to the sprite editor and choose the skinning editor in the bottom last row. Alright, now we have our character all together, ready to get its own skeleton. You can see on the left there is a bunch of different categories. We have the top for the pose, below that there is a category called bones, then there's geometry, weights, and in the end rig. Now if we click on auto weights, for example, Unity generates automatically some geometry for the sprites, but since we don't have bones yet, this won't really work. The weights have nothing to be based on yet. So what we want to do is we want to click on bones, create bone, and now we have this little red dot which is going to mark the very start of our first bone, which is the root bone usually. Meaning all the other bones will depend on that first bone. So now we get to think about where that placement would make most sense, and we can use our common knowledge for this about our own human skeleton as well here. We're going to use as our start point the tailbone basically. And create a kind of spine along the way towards the chest, neck, and then up until the tip of the head. These are now our solid main bones, and now we have to do some child bones as well that are connected and depend on our main bones. So we click on the root of the head bone here, and now we can create a new bone, see with those slightly transparent strings attached, and place it to the start of the left antenna sprite, for example. So the same we do as well for both of the ears, the earring, would be nice to move that one as well, of course, and then we go to the neck bone and connect the shoulders and arms with it. When it comes to this, it really helps a lot imagining what an actual skeleton looks like and where and what is connected with what. So we take the hip now and create the legs and feet, and then we have a creature with a tail, so that needs to be movable as well, of course. Also, if you want to animate an eye blink later, you need to even give the eye sprites bones in order to squash and stretch them or move them. Same goes for the hair. If you want to have it move, everything basically you want to be able to move and transform around needs some kind of bone. And in the end, don't forget to hit apply on the top right corner, otherwise you're gonna lose all of it again. Now we have our skeleton, but if we look into the hierarchy, we can see we kind of have a problem now. The bones are what we're going to see later once we animate, and now we have 28 different bones, which are all called bone 1, bone 2, bone 3, etc. It's the same as with the layers of the sprites before, so how are we supposed to remember which bone is what part of the body? We absolutely can't. So you could either go now and rename each and every bone, but you kinda need to figure out already again which bone is which, or we do it right from the very beginning and avoid chaos and confusion straight away. So, let's start again. New rig and let's go. Root bone, hip bone, chest bone, neck bone, and stop. Name it already. We're going to start with core bone, then this one we're gonna name hip bone, this one is the backbone. Okay, neck bone, head bone. But wait, we probably shouldn't just randomly name it. Let's remind ourselves of a solid naming convention. In this case, we already have a few characters and they already have working rigs, so we should stick to how we named them to stay consistent. So let's check for Emmet, our craftsman, how we named the bones there. Root bone, okay, makes sense. Chest bone, alright. Neck bone, okay. Then we go back to our seamstress. Let's stick to the naming convention and continue with that. In general, it is always helpful staying in routine and developing an own set of logic and rules that makes sense for you and that you can acquire and establish over time for yourself. It helps a lot automatically staying structured and staying in your workflow. You kind of develop habits over time that make your entire process so much more efficient. So either if you start a new one, think of something that is logic and makes sense for your naming convention, or if you already have one, it doesn't hurt to go back and check on how you used to do it and stick to that. Okay. Now, let's look into the hierarchy again. Hey, nice! That looks a lot more structured and obvious and well to read and understand now. I mean, it's still 28 different bones, but at least we now understand and know which one is which. Okay, let's move over to step number 5, weight painting. Okay, now we can move on to the weights. If we now generate our weights automatically, this is what's gonna happen. Wonderful, chaotic rainbow colors all over our character. Great! Actually, it looks pretty, but we still don't really want to work with that, so we have to adjust a little bit. Because what the color shows is the bone influence on the sprite. If we have this colorful mix, it means that kind of all bones are influencing that sprite movement, so that would be a bit problematic. What we are going to do now is we're going to select our right arm, click on bone influence, then we can see another little hierarchy on the right that opens up for the right arm, showing all the bones that are currently influencing it. And you can see in the list there's a bunch of bones that don't really belong into our right arm. So we're checking our arm bone, okay, our lower arm bone looks good. Tailbone? No, you don't belong here, my friend. So we select it and throw it out by simply pressing on the minus over there. Same with our leg bone. Now our hand bone makes sense again, but our calf bone, out. And what we saw happening already is the colors are adjusting to our changes already. So now we have exactly 3 bones, the upper arm bone, lower arm bone, and the hand bone influencing our sprite. And we have only 3 colors as well, showing a smooth fade between them. Okay, to demonstrate one more time, let's do the same with the body, because that one is usually the most chaotic. We have a whole list to scroll through all the bones that are currently influencing the sprite. So let's see. Root bone? Okay. Tailbone too? Nope. Our calf bone? No. Our hand bone? No. Hip bone? Alright. Chest bone? Yes. Our arm bone? Nope. Neck bone? Yes sir. L arm bone? Out. L lower arm bone? No. L hand bone? Nope. L leg bone can go out as well. Same with our leg bone. And, oh whoops, I forgot our lower arm bone there. You can leave as well. And now there we are. With our 4 bones, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 colors as well. Looks good. Same procedure now for all the rest of the bones and sprites as well, until we have it all cleared up. This is now kind of ready to work with already, but I wanted to show you what that is as well. Weight brushes. As an artist, you most definitely heard about weight painting already. But so far, this whole thing has not much to do with painting, right? Here's where this whole painting thing comes from, and we're gonna select our weight brush. And now what we can do is we choose a bone. So let's take the hand bone, for example, which has the color purple here, and we're going to paint this color into the second bone, the blue bone area. And what it does is basically it changes how much influence the bone has and how much is going to be moved by the bone. So we can select the size of our brush as well, we can adjust the hardness and everything. Feel free to try around with this a bit and see how it influences the movement. Also, a little reminder again, don't forget to apply everything in the end. Okay, now we move forward to step number 6, and this is the very last one because we start animating now. Step 6, test your rig. Before starting to animate, be sure to check and select the frame rate you want to work on. For our game, we decided to go for 30 frames per second, for example, but you can choose to work in whichever frame rate you want to. Then I go and already prepare a couple of files and name them, set their sample rate as well. I do this as one step for preparation basically, so I don't mess something up in the future or forget. And now this one is quite the fun part, where you can fool around completely and turn off your brain. Just see how your bones work, what the limit of your movements is, and get a feeling for what you can do and what looks good. Really try to check every bone to avoid having to change anything on a rig later again, once you already started animating, because this might cause major problems that in the end just can be resolved through having to animate the entire thing all over again. And especially if this is your first time animating in Unity, try and see what the program is capable of and what your options are. You can obviously rotate a bone, but you can also stretch and transform it, you can scale it and so on. And now, if we look into our animation window, we can see all the things we manipulated for this one pose. A very scary long list, but you will get used to it eventually, at some point, maybe. And aren't we super happy we did a proper naming convention now? Imagine this whole list would now be only consisted of something like bone 1, bone 2, until bone 28 standing there now. That would be a total disaster. Okay, and now let's finally start animating.